February 14, 1929. 7 men stand against a brick wall in a Chicago garage, their hands raised. They think they're being shaken down by corrupt cops. It's routine in this city. But in seconds, the staccato crack of Thompson submachine guns shatters the cold morning air. 70 rounds tear through flesh and bone. When the smoke clears, the garage floor runs red with blood, and America realizes it's living in the grip of something unprecedented. One man's shadow loomed over this massacre. A man who built an empire worth over $100 million in today's money, while the nation starved during the Great Depression. A man who dressed in $1,000 suits while ordering murders over breakfast. A man who became America's first celebrity gangster. His name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. But you know him as Al Capone. Scarface. Public enemy number one. And the way they finally brought him down? It wasn't for murder. It wasn't for bootlegging. It wasn't even for the Valentine's Day massacre. It was for something far more ordinary, and that's what makes this story so incredible. This is the story of how America's most notorious criminal built an untouchable empire, terrorized a city, and fell because he forgot to pay his taxes. Before there was Scarface, there was just Alphonse. Born January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents who had come to America chasing the same dream as millions of others. His father Gabriel was a barber. His mother Teresa raised 9 children in a cramped tenement apartment where the American dream felt more like a cruel joke. Young Al wasn't born evil. Teachers described him as bright but restless. He made it to 6th grade before an altercation with a teacher ended his formal education at 14. But the streets of Brooklyn? Those would provide an education far more profitable and infinitely more dangerous. He found his real teachers in the Brooklyn docks and pool halls. Men like Johnny Torrio and Frankie Yale ran the neighborhood rackets, and they saw potential in the tough, charismatic kid with quick fists and quicker thinking. By 18, Capone was working as a bartender and bouncer at the Harvard Inn, a Coney Island dive where Yale ran gambling operations. It was there that Capone made the mistake that gave him his infamous nickname. He insulted a patron's sister. Her brother slashed Capone's face 3 times with a knife, leaving scars that would mark him forever. He hated the name Scarface, preferring to tell people the scars came from the Great War. But the streets knew the truth. In 1918, Capone seemed to be on a different path. He married May Coughlin, an Irish girl who gave him a son, Albert. For a moment, legitimacy beckoned. He tried regular work as a bookkeeper. But the straight life didn't pay like crime, and crime was in his blood now. The turning point came in 1919 when Congress passed the Volstead Act, enforcing Prohibition. Overnight, drinking alcohol became illegal across America. And overnight, every speakeasy, every bottle of bootleg whiskey, every gin joint became a gold mine. When Johnny Torrio invited Capone to Chicago to help run his operations, Al didn't hesitate. Chicago in the 1920s was a city eating itself alive. Corruption flowed through City Hall like poison. Police captains made more from bribes than their salaries. Politicians were bought and sold like commodities. And into this cesspool of opportunity stepped Al Capone. Initially working under Torrio, Capone proved himself ruthless and brilliant. He understood that violence was just business and business was booming. When rival gangs challenged their territory, Capone didn't negotiate. He eliminated. By 1925, after Torrio barely survived an assassination attempt and retired, the empire fell to Capone. He was just 26 years old, but he controlled gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging operations that stretched across Chicago and beyond. In the Roaring Twenties, Capone ruled an empire of crime in the Windy City covering gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, bribery, narcotics trafficking, robbery, protection rackets, and murder. But ruling required eliminating competition. And Capone was about to show Chicago just how far he was willing to go. Imagine running a city where the police work for you, where judges rule in your favor, where witnesses disappear before they can testify. That was Al Capone's Chicago. His headquarters was the Lexington Hotel, where he occupied a 50-room suite. He moved through the city in armor-plated Cadillacs, surrounded by bodyguards carrying Thompson submachine guns. He wore custom suits, smoked Cuban cigars, and ate at the finest restaurants. To some, he was Robin Hood, using his wealth to open soup kitchens during the Depression. To others, he was America's nightmare made flesh. But one man stood in his way, George "Bugs" Moran, leader of Chicago's North Side Gang. They'd been warring for years, fighting over territory, over profits, over pride. By 1926, more than 12,000 murders were taking place every year across America, and Chicago led the nation in bloodshed. Capone decided to end the war permanently. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 members of Moran's gang gathered at the SMC Cartage Company garage on North Clark Street. The men were gathered at a Lincoln Park, Chicago garage when between 4 and 6 men entered, 2 of whom were disguised as police officers. They thought it was a routine shakedown. It was an execution. The bloody incident dramatized the intense rivalry for control of the illegal liquor traffic during the Prohibition era in the United States. The killers lined the men against a brick wall and opened fire with Thompson submachine guns. 70 rounds in seconds. The Valentine's Day Massacre, as it became known, shocked even hardened Chicago residents. Capone had an alibi. He was in Florida, meeting with prosecutors to discuss other charges. Convenient, wasn't it? The massacre remains an unsolved crime and was never officially linked to Capone, but he was generally considered to have been responsible for the murders. But the massacre was Capone's greatest mistake. It turned him into a national obsession. Newspapers across America splashed his face on front pages. Hollywood made movies inspired by his exploits. Parents frightened children with stories of Scarface. And most dangerous of all, the massacre caught the attention of newly elected President Herbert Hoover. Hoover made Capone's capture his administration's priority. Herbert Hoover, the newly elected president, made fighting crime and putting Al Capone behind bars a top priority for his administration. Simultaneously, the Chicago Crime Commission dubbed Capone Public Enemy Number 1. Public Enemy Number 1. It was official now. The question was, how do you catch a man who seems untouchable? A man who has the police in his pocket? A man who makes witnesses disappear? A man who's never been convicted of anything significant? You don't catch him for what he's done. You catch him for what he's forgotten to do. It seemed that law enforcement couldn't touch him. Every investigation hit a wall. Every witness developed amnesia. Every piece of evidence mysteriously vanished. Capone had built his empire on fear and cash, and both were effective deterrents to justice. But there were men who wouldn't back down. Elliot Ness and his team of incorruptible agents, dubbed the Untouchables because they couldn't be bribed, began raiding Capone's breweries and speakeasies. They were like gnats to Capone, irritating but not fatal. The real danger came from somewhere he never expected. The Treasury Department. A team of accountants and investigators, led by Agent Frank Wilson, began examining Capone's finances. They couldn't prove the murders, but they could prove something else. Capone hadn't paid taxes on his illegal income. Think about that for a moment. The man who orchestrated dozens of murders, ran prostitution rings, corrupted an entire city, would be brought down by accountants. Wilson's team worked tirelessly, following paper trails, interviewing bookkeepers, examining ledgers. They discovered that Capone's organization had made millions, and he'd paid taxes on almost none of it. His lavish lifestyle, the custom suits, the Cuban cigars, the gambling losses, proved he had income. But he'd reported almost nothing to the IRS. In 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion. The Bureau of Investigation, the FBI's predecessor, joined the Bureau of Prohibition and other agencies in investigating Capone. Capone was confident. He'd beaten every charge before. His lawyers were the best money could buy. He even tried to negotiate a plea deal, expecting a light sentence. But the judge wouldn't play ball. Capone would face trial. The trial was a spectacle. Reporters packed the courtroom. Capone sat confident, smirking, sure he'd walk free. But Wilson's case was airtight. Document after document proved Capone had income he'd never reported. Witnesses, terrified but brave, testified about the organization's finances. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the verdict rang through the courtroom, guilty on 5 counts. In 1931, Capone was sentenced to prison for tax evasion. The judge sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, the harshest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion at that time, plus $80,000 in fines and costs. America's public enemy number 1, the man who'd orchestrated countless murders and terrorized a city, was going to prison not for his violence, but for cheating on his taxes. Would you have believed it if someone told you that's how the story would end? That this criminal mastermind would fall not to bullets or betrayal, but to paperwork? But the story doesn't end there. Because prison was just the beginning of Capone's real punishment. Capone first served time at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, then was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1934. Alcatraz, the Rock, was designed to hold America's most dangerous criminals in complete isolation. No special treatment. No corruption. No escape. For the first time in decades, Al Capone was just another number. Prisoner 85. But something far worse than prison was destroying him from within. Suffering from a case of syphilis that left him too mentally ill to resume his previous criminal activities, Capone's mind began to deteriorate. The disease, left untreated from his youth, was eating away at his brain. By the time he was released in 1939 for good behavior, Capone was a shell of the man who'd once ruled Chicago. His mental capacity had deteriorated to that of a 12-year-old. He was confused, often incoherent, and incapable of running any criminal enterprise. He spent his final years in his Palm Island, Florida estate, fishing and playing cards with family, often not recognizing people he'd known for decades. The man who'd inspired fear across America was now pitted by those who remembered him. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone suffered a stroke. He died shortly after, surrounded by family, at age 48. His death certificate listed the causes as cardiac arrest, pneumonia, and apoplexy. But really, syphilis had killed him years before, slowly and cruelly erasing the man who thought he was untouchable. So what does the story of Al Capone teach us? That crime doesn't pay? That's too simple. Capone lived like a king for years, wielding power most people can't imagine. That justice always prevails? Perhaps. But it took creative thinking and relentless determination. It took accountants willing to dig through mountains of paperwork and agents willing to risk their lives. Maybe the real lesson is about hubris. Capone believed he was untouchable, that his power made him invincible. He forgot that empires built on violence and fear are inherently unstable. He forgot that every system has a weakness. And he forgot the old saying, nothing is certain except death and taxes. His legacy? Organized crime in the city had a lower profile once Prohibition was repealed, already wary of attention after seeing Capone's notoriety bring him down. Future criminals learned from his mistakes, operating in the shadows instead of seeking fame. But Capone changed America. He showed how organized crime could flourish in modern cities, how corruption could spread like cancer through institutions, and how celebrity and criminality could merge into something darkly fascinating. Do you think justice was truly served in this case? A man responsible for countless murders died comfortably in his mansion, his mind destroyed by disease rather than imprisoned for his true crimes. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe for more deep dives into history's most notorious criminals. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next documentary. And remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The lessons from Capone's rise and fall echo in today's world of power, corruption, and consequences. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious about the dark corners of history.